The snow came down like shattered glass, cutting through the air so thick a man could barely see his own hands. Rory Callahan heard the screams before he saw anything, high and desperate, a woman's voice tearing through the howl of wind. He pulled his horse to a halt, every instinct in his body going still. She was maybe 30 yards off the trail, stumbling through drifts that came up past her knees, her arms wrapped around something small. A child. Rory kicked his mare forward, the animal fighting him against the storm, but he drove her on anyway. When he reached the woman, she nearly collapsed into him, her face so pale it looked like death had already brushed her cheek. "Please," she gasped, and her teeth were chattering so hard the word barely came out whole. "My daughter, she won't wake up." Rory didn't ask questions. He pulled the little girl from her mother's arms and felt the weight of her, light as kindling, cold as stone. The child's lips were blue. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her, then hauled the woman up onto his horse behind him. She was shaking so violently he thought she might fall off, so he reached back and gripped her wrist hard enough to hurt. "Hold on," he said, and he meant it. The nearest shelter was a trapper's cabin he'd passed an hour back, half buried in snow but still standing. He rode harder than he should have in a storm like that, but the girl's face kept flashing in his mind, blue lips, closed eyes, the awful stillness of her. When they reached the cabin, he kicked the door open and carried them both inside. The place was freezing, but at least the wind couldn't reach them. Rory got a fire going while the woman crouched over her daughter, rubbing the girl's hands and whispering things he couldn't hear. He didn't interrupt. Once the flames were strong enough, he pulled a blanket from his pack and brought it over. "Get her close to the fire," he said. "Not too close, just enough." The woman looked up at him, and for the first time he saw her clearly. Dark hair stuck to her face in wet tangles, eyes the color of creek water in summer, green and brown all mixed together. She was young, maybe 25, and she had the kind of face that looked like it smiled easy, except right now it was carved with fear. "She's breathing," the woman said, and her voice cracked, "but she's so cold." "She'll warm up," Rory said, though he wasn't sure. He'd seen frostbite take men's fingers, seen cold steal the life right out of people who thought they'd make it another mile, but he didn't say that. He built the fire higher, then went outside to unsaddle his horse and bring her into the corner of the cabin where the wind wouldn't reach. When he came back in, the woman had wrapped herself around her daughter, holding her tight. The girl's eyes were still closed, but her breathing looked steadier. Rory sat down against the far wall, giving them space. The silence stretched out, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the storm battering the walls. After a while, the woman spoke without looking at him. "Her name's Clara," she said. "She's 5. What's yours?" Evelyn Marsh." "Rory Callahan." She nodded, still watching her daughter. Her hands were moving over Clara's hair, smoothing it back over and over like she couldn't stop. "We were trying to get to Fort Hayward," she said. "My husband, he was supposed to meet us there 2 weeks ago. We waited, but the money ran out, and I thought," she stopped, swallowed hard, "I thought we could make it." Rory didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. The frontier was full of people who thought they could make it and didn't. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly, "for stopping. Anyone would have." She looked at him then, and something in her expression made his chest tighten. "No," she said, "they wouldn't." The storm kept them trapped in that cabin for 3 days. Clara woke up on the second morning, groggy and confused, but alive. Evelyn cried when the girl opened her eyes, and Rory turned away to give her privacy, busying himself with checking the firewood. He'd never been good with tears. The cabin was small, 1 room, a broken table, a wood stove that barely worked. Rory hunted what he could in the lulls between snowfall, bringing back a rabbit on the 2nd day and a grouse on the 3rd. Evelyn cooked them over the fire, her hands steady even though he could see how tired she was. She didn't complain. She didn't talk much at all, except to Clara, and even then her voice was soft, like she was trying not to take up too much space in the world. Rory noticed things about her he shouldn't have. The way she braided her hair every morning, even though it would just come loose again. The way she sang to Clara when she thought he wasn't listening, old hymns that sounded sadder than they probably were. The way she looked at him sometimes when she thought he wasn't watching, like she was trying to figure out what kind of man he was. He didn't know what she'd find if she looked too hard. On the third night, after Clara had fallen asleep, Evelyn sat down across the fire from him. She'd been quieter than usual all day, and he'd learned enough about her by then to know that meant she was chewing on something in her mind. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Go ahead. Why were you out there in the storm?" Rory poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise. "Had business in Coulter's Ridge, was heading back." "Back where?" "Nowhere in particular." She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her studying him. "You don't seem like a drifter," she said. "What do I seem like?" "I don't know yet." He smiled a little at that, though he didn't look at her. Most folks think they know right off. Most folks are wrong about most things. That made him glance up, and he found her watching him with those Creekwater eyes. There was something in her face that made his throat go tight, something tired and stubborn and real. "You got people waiting for you?" she asked, "wherever you're going?" "No. That lonely or that free?" Rory considered the question longer than he should have. "Both, I guess." Evelyn nodded slowly, like that made sense to her. Then she looked down at her hands, and he saw her twist the ring on her finger, a thin gold band that had probably been pretty once, before the frontier wore it down. "My husband's name was Thomas," she said, and Rory heard the past tense before she even finished. He died 4 months ago. Fever took him in 2 days." "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "I kept pretending he was just late, kept telling Clara her daddy was waiting for us, that we just had to get to Fort Hayward and he'd be there. But he's not there, he's not anywhere." Rory didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Evelyn pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them, and stared into the fire. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said quietly. "I don't know where we're supposed to go. I don't know how to keep her safe." "You kept her alive this long." "Barely. That's still something." She looked at him again, and this time her eyes were wet. "Why do you care?" The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "I don't know." But that was a lie, and they both knew it. When the storm finally broke, Rory saddled his horse and told Evelyn he'd take them to Fort Hayward. She didn't argue, though he could see the hesitation in her face, the worry about being a burden, the fear of trusting someone she barely knew. But Clara was still weak, and the snow was deep, and she didn't have a choice. They rode together, Clara sitting in front of Evelyn, Evelyn sitting in front of Rory. It was cramped and awkward, and he was too aware of the way her back pressed against his chest, the way her hair smelled like wood smoke, and something softer he couldn't name. He kept his eyes on the trail, and his thoughts locked down tight. Fort Hayward was a 2-day ride in good weather. It took them 4. They stopped at a way station on the second night, a rough-built place where travelers could pay for a bed and a meal. Rory got them a room, just one, because it was all they had, and he slept on the floor while Evelyn and Clara took the bed. He woke up once in the middle of the night and saw Evelyn sitting by the window, looking out at the stars. She didn't say anything, and neither did he. On the 4th day, they rode into Fort Hayward just as the sun was setting. The place was bigger than Rory had expected, a sprawling mess of buildings and people, all of them looking like they were just passing through on their way to somewhere else. Evelyn went stiff in front of him as they rode down the main street, and he knew she was looking for her husband's ghost. "Where do you want to go?" Rory asked. She was quiet for a long time, then she said, "I don't know." He took them to a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Haverfield, a broad-shouldered widow who asked no questions and charged fair rates. Rory paid for a week up front, and Evelyn looked at him like he'd just handed her the moon. "You don't have to." "I know. I can't pay you back. Didn't ask you to." She bit her lip, and he saw her struggling with something, pride maybe, or shame. Finally she just said, "Thank you." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Rory." He looked back. "Where are you going now?" Got a friend runs a ranch about 50 miles south. Figure I'll head that way. She nodded, but she didn't say anything else, and he could see the goodbye sitting heavy between them. He wanted to say something, something that would make this easier or harder or something, but the words wouldn't come. So he just left. Rory made it 20 miles before he turned around. He told himself it was stupid, told himself she didn't need him, that she'd figure things out on her own, that getting tangled up with a widow and her kid was the last thing a man like him should do. He'd spent 10 years keeping his life simple, no ties, no responsibilities, no one depending on him for anything. But he kept seeing Clara's blue lips, kept hearing Evelyn's voice in the cabin, asking him why he cared. He made it back to Fort Hayward by noon the next day. Mrs. Haverfield told him Evelyn had gone to the general store, so he waited on the porch of the boarding house, feeling like a fool. When Evelyn finally came walking up the street with Clara's hand in hers, she stopped dead when she saw him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. "You came back," she said, and her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "Yeah. Why?" Rory rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly aware of how many people were walking past, how many eyes might be watching. Thought maybe you could use some help getting settled. Evelyn's expression shifted, something between disbelief and hope and fear all tangled together. "Rory, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm offering." She shook her head slowly, but she was smiling just a little. "You're a strange man." "Been told that before." Clara tugged on her mother's hand, looking up at Rory with big, curious eyes. "Are you gonna stay with us?" Evelyn's face went red. "Clara." "Just for a bit," Rory said, crouching down so he was eye level with the girl. "Till your mama gets things sorted. That all right with you?" Clara nodded solemnly, like they'd just made an important pact. When Rory stood up, Evelyn was watching him with that look again, the one that made his chest feel too tight. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally just said, "Okay." And that was how it started. Rory found work at a lumber mill on the edge of town, and he spent his days hauling timber and his evenings sitting on the porch of the boarding house with Evelyn and Clara. Evelyn got a job doing laundry for the hotel, and Rory could see how tired it made her, the way her hands got red and raw from the lye. But she never complained. She just kept moving forward, one day at a time. They fell into a rhythm without planning it. Rory would walk Clara to the schoolhouse on his way to the mill, and Evelyn would have coffee waiting when he came back in the evenings. They'd sit together on the porch, not saying much, just watching the town settle into night. Sometimes Clara would fall asleep between them, and Evelyn would carry her inside, and Rory would sit alone in the dark, wondering what the hell he was doing. People started talking, the way people do. Mrs. Haverfield made pointed comments about propriety. A woman at the hotel told Evelyn it wasn't decent, a widow keeping company with a man she wasn't married to. Evelyn's face went pale when she told Rory about it, and he saw the shame creeping back into her eyes. "Maybe you should go," she said one night, and her voice was barely a whisper. "People are starting to." "I don't care what people say." "But I do." She looked at him, and he saw tears threatening to spill over. I can't have them thinking I'm." "They don't know you," Rory said, and there was an edge to his voice he couldn't smooth out. "They don't know what you've been through, and they sure as hell don't have any right to judge." "That doesn't stop them." He didn't have an answer to that. The turning point came 6 weeks after they arrived in Fort Hayward. Rory was walking back from the mill when he saw Evelyn standing outside the general store, her face white as snow. A man was talking to her, tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that didn't quite hide the meanness in his face. Rory didn't recognize him, but he recognized the look in Evelyn's eyes. "He crossed the street fast." "Told you before, Mrs. Marsh," the man was saying, his voice loud enough to draw stares. "Decent women don't parade themselves around town with strange men. It's disgraceful." "Mr. Garrett, I'm not." "You got a child to think about. What kind of example are you setting?" Rory stepped up beside Evelyn, and the man, Garrett, turned to look at him. his lip curled. "This the one," Garrett said to Evelyn, like Rory wasn't standing right there. "That's enough," Rory said quietly. "I'm speaking to the lady. And now you're done." Garrett's face went red, and Rory saw his hands curl into fists. For a second, he thought the man might actually take a swing, and part of him almost wanted it. But then Garrett just spat on the ground near Rory's boots and turned away. "Whore," he muttered, just loud enough for them to hear. Rory moved before he could think, grabbing Garrett by the shoulder and spinning him around. The punch connected with the man's jaw hard enough to drop him, and suddenly there were people shouting, and Evelyn was pulling on Rory's arm, saying his name over and over. Garrett stayed down, blood on his lip, glaring up at Rory with murder in his eyes. "You'll regret that." Rory just walked away, Evelyn's hand still on his arm. They didn't talk until they got back to the boarding house. Evelyn went inside without a word, and Rory stood on the porch, his knuckles throbbing, his heart pounding too hard. After a while, the door opened and Evelyn came back out. She didn't look at him. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "He called you." "I know what he called me." Her voice was tight, controlled, "and now everyone in town knows it too." "Evelyn, you need to go, Rory." The words hit him like a punch. "What?" "You need to leave. It's not working. People talk, and they're not going to stop, and I can't." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. "I can't do this to Clara. I can't have her growing up with people whispering about her mother." Rory felt something crack open in his chest. "So that's it, you're just gonna let them win." "It's not about winning." She looked at him finally, and her eyes were full of tears. "It's about surviving, and right now you're making that harder." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that running away from this wouldn't solve anything, that he'd stay and fight every man in this town if that's what it took. But he saw the exhaustion in her face, the weight of everything she'd been carrying, and he knew she couldn't take any more. "All right," he said, and his voice came out rough. "I'll go." She nodded, not looking at him. "But I need you to know something first." He waited until she met his eyes. "I didn't come back because I felt sorry for you. I came back because—" He stopped, struggling with words he'd never been good at. "Because you matter, you and Clara, and I don't know what that means, but I know it's true." Evelyn's face crumpled, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. Rory left before sunrise. He made it 3 days. On the third night, he was camped by a creek about 60 miles south of Fort Hayward when he heard hoofbeats. He stood up, hand on his gun, and then he saw her. Evelyn riding hard, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She pulled her horse to a stop and slid down, stumbling a little. Rory caught her by the shoulders. "What happened? Where's Clara?" "She's safe. Mrs. Haverfield's watching her." Evelyn was breathing hard, her hands clutching his shirt. "I had to find you. I couldn't let you go like that." "Evelyn." "I lied," she said, and her voice was fierce. "I lied when I said you were making things harder. You're the only thing that's made anything easier since Thomas died. You're the only person who's looked at me like I'm not broken." Rory's throat went tight. "You're not broken." "I feel like I am. Every day, I feel like I'm one step away from falling apart. But when you're there, I don't feel that way. And I'm so tired of being afraid." He pulled her closer, and she let him, burying her face against his chest. He could feel her shaking, and he wrapped his arms around her like he could hold her together by will alone. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be with someone again. I don't know if I even should." "Then don't," Rory said quietly. "Don't decide anything right now. Just let me come back, let me be there, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and he saw something shift in her eyes, something like hope, fragile and new. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They rode back to Fort Hayward together, arriving just as dawn broke over the town. People stared as they walked down the street, and Rory saw the whispers starting again, but Evelyn held her head high. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look afraid. She just looked like a woman, who'd made her choice. Mrs. Haverfield met them at the door, Clara in her arms. The little girl's face lit up when she saw Rory, and she wriggled free, running to him. He scooped her up, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. "You came back," Clara said. "Yeah," Rory said, looking at Evelyn over the girl's head. "I did." Evelyn smiled, and it was the first time he'd seen her smile like that, full and real and unguarded. And in that moment, standing in the morning light with this woman and her daughter, Rory Callahan knew he'd found the place he'd been drifting toward his whole life. He just hadn't known he was looking for it until now.